I'm Andy Grotto. I'm the program director of the program on geopolitics technology in governance. I want to thank Nate and Dan and Mike for their leadership and vision for putting this center together. I'm thrilled to be on the leadership team of this new Stanford Cyber Policy Center and to have the opportunity to launch the program you see displayed behind you. I also want to offer a heartfelt thanks to Amy Ziegert and Herb Lin, neither of whom could be here today, but have been key parts of the Stanford legacy and will continue to be a key part of our efforts moving forward. I've been inspired and humbled by their scholarship and their leadership. I also appreciate the friendship and support I've received from the Hewlett Foundation, Eli Sugarman, his team of Monica Ruiz and Marlene Zapata. Thank you very much. I also want to acknowledge and thank Danielle Jablonski, my program manager and right-hand gal, for all the effort she's put into getting our program launched. And of course, Allison Burke, who made, as you saw this morning, some very substantive contributions to our launch report. She also led the effort to put this conference together. So thank you very much, Allison, for all your hard work. Nuclear capability was the defining geostrategic technology of the last century. Gave nations unparalleled destructive power in the form of atomic weaponry, and its peaceful applications inspired optimism about the power of technology to improve lives and enhance prosperity. That optimism, strong in the 1950s and 1960s, gradually faded as many of the predicted applications of the atom proved impractical, and the safety, security, and health risks of abuse and carelessness came into clearer focus. Still, nuclear technologies underpinned groundbreaking innovation in energy production, medicine, measurement science, and countless other domains. The defining geostrategic technology of this century will be the digital technologies that comprise the third wave of IT innovation: artificial intelligence, machine learning, quantum computing, and the smart connected devices that employ them. These third wave technologies build on two previous waves of IT innovation: the commoditization of computing power in the 1960s and 1970s, followed by the emergence of the internet in the 1980s and 1990s and its maturation into the 2000s. Like nuclear technologies, third wave technologies will revolutionize warfare and create new challenges and opportunities in statecraft. They'll enable automation in countless domains and lead to as of yet unknown applications that catalyze new industries and business models, and in the process massively alter how economic value is created, captured, and distributed, with ripple effects in domestic politics and the broader global political economy. Now, the demands on the domestic and international institutions for governance are going to be profound as sensors, processors, and connectivity become standard in devices ranging from consumer goods to critical infrastructure. Often, but not always, these smart connected devices will bring significant value to users and consumers in the form of more features, better performance, and lower cost of delivering services. But they also create a host of safety, security, and privacy risks. These risks include exposure of people and organizations to new modes of catastrophic product failure, additional attack vectors for malicious actors to conduct offensive cyber operations, and improper collection and use of personal information. What makes risk management and governance of smart connected devices uniquely complex, however, is the fact that all three risk factors, safety, security, and privacy, may be present simultaneously, creating dynamic interdependencies. Commuter trains, as one example, used to be metal boxes with seats on wheels operated in real time by human beings on mechanically switched and signaled tracks. Safety has always been a critical factor, but privacy was not, and cybersecurity risks, to the extent it was managed at all, was primarily about back-end office systems and not about operational infrastructure. Modern rail cars, however, collect passenger data. They offer Wi-Fi connectivity. They exchange location and diagnostic data with each other and with the wider transportation infrastructure. And they operate under computer control with increasing automation. They're a system of smart connected systems where cybersecurity and privacy risks could give rise to potentially devastating safety risks. This convergence of risk factors is increasingly true of all smart connected infrastructure, from rail to autos to energy to healthcare. Now, the prevailing practice in business and in government is to treat these risk domains as distinct verticals, with siloed safety, security, and privacy teams managing risk and conducting policy within their respective silos. Siloed approaches, as I learned in my time in government, can result in governance strategies that fail to optimize across the three risk domains. Just consider the case of autos and their increased collection and use of geolocation data. This data can enhance safety by contributing to automation, and in the event of an accident, alert first responders and potentially save lives. But geolocation is obviously sensitive from a privacy perspective as well. Similarly, network connectivity in medical devices can facilitate patient data collection and analysis. It can enable device diagnostics and make it possible to update devices with additional features or security patches. But this connectivity in the name of safety is also a potential attack vector for malicious cyber actors, and thus a source of safety and privacy risk in its own right. These interdependencies illustrate how a siloed approach to managing one dimension of the risks facing smart connected devices can affect the other risks. So a major thrust of GTG, as we're calling it for short, would be to characterize and assess these interdependencies, put them in both historical and comparative context, and identify risk management methodologies and policies. And we have a number of we'll have a number of projects underway, including on corporate governance and auto safety. But there's also a geopolitical layer to the governance challenge. Technological innovation and economic clout have always underpinned military strength. And at a superficial level, the two equities, security interests and economic interests, are broadly aligned, the yin and yang of geopolitical power. As a practical matter, however, the two equities often come into conflict. There are complex trade-offs. This was certainly true, for example, in the initial decades of the nuclear era for the United States, when economic imperatives created pressures in the United States to export civilian nuclear technologies, despite the evident risk that proliferation of nuclear weaponry posed to American security interests. Indeed, one can interpret much of the history of efforts to control the spread of nuclear weapons through this lens of how to harness the economic benefits of a technology while limiting its security dangers. Now, the cornerstone treaty of the nonproliferation regime, the NPT, entered into force 25 years after the first use of atomic weaponry. And the modern mix of advanced safeguards and export controls that reinforce the NPT's core norms didn't emerge in consolidated form until some 30 years after that. Now, on some level, the governance regime for nuclear weapons has been remarkably successful. JFK's prediction, I think it was in 1963, that about a world with dozens of nuclear powers never came to pass. And more countries have given up nuclear weapons than have gone on to acquire them. Still, this governance regime benefited enormously from certain characteristics about nuclear technology that created inherent barriers to acquisition and misuse that significantly reduced the burden on the nuclear governance regime to manage risks. So high capital costs, niche applications, non-commodity components and expertise, supply chains involving physical transfer of highly regulated goods, and so on. I submit that these barriers are largely absent when it comes to third-wave technologies, which means that the governance regime will bear a much heavier load of the burden for balancing the benefits of these technologies against the risks. And in particular, governance initiatives for third-wave technologies will need to manage risks associated with use, since denying acquisition, the governance strategy underlying the nuclear nonproliferation regime, will be a losing proposition over the medium to long term. Now, to see why this is the case, consider a few divergent characteristics of nuclear and third-wave technologies. First, the barriers to entry for nuclear programs, whether civilian or military, are very high, making governance strategies for nuclear technology organized around counterproliferation, denying access, viable. Tech has far fewer barriers, rendering access denial a non-viable strategy. Indeed, strategies will have to shape how actors, state and non-state alike, use the technology, a far more complex endeavor with micro and macro political economic factors. Second, the security and economic trade-offs in nuclear are pretty clear, thanks to limited market demand for civilian nuclear applications and a shared threat perception about proliferation risks among most nuclear suppliers. Third-wave technologies, by contrast, are predicted to fuel a fourth industrial revolution. Demand is going to grow. The economic equities will grow, making decisions about economic and security trade-offs that much harder in this new world we're in. This dynamic, these trade-offs between and interdependencies across risk domains are going to become increasingly common as a major source of friction in cyber policymaking. This was true in my time in government, and I think we're at the very front end of an intensive period of policymaking involving these trade-offs. National security decisions affect economic equities. Best example there that most people are probably familiar with is the Snowden disclosures. The United States conducted signals intelligence to advance a national security mission. When Snowden leaked NSA documents, the fallout to U.S. industry was high, not least of which it essentially killed the safe harbor agreement we had with the European Commission to allow the transfer of data about Europeans to be exported from Europe. That had a huge and significant impact on our country's economic equities vis-a-vis trade and competition. Economic sanctions have come up a couple times in our discussion today. Economic sanctions also implicate this trade-off between security and economic interests. We levy sanctions typically for some national security objective, but there's a cost. Increasingly, sanctions create a set of incentives for global actors to find alternatives to the US dollar, which in the long run would undermine a source of financial strength for our economy. Economic decisions also affect national security. So for example, infrastructure investments, I mentioned commuter rail a few minutes ago, when state and local governments have to make decisions about where to buy infrastructure from, they're typically focused on best value, which is typically a matter of cost. Cybersecurity is seldom a factor, and that's why you see this churn in Washington, D.C. right now over the possibility and perhaps even the probability that the Chinese state-owned rail company, CRRC, will be in a very competitive position to win the contract for the next generation of commuter rail cars in Washington, D.C. But it's not just government that faces this problem. So private decisions animated by business interests can also have huge impacts on national security. Social media is an obvious example. We spent most of the day so far talking about business decisions by social media platforms, Facebook and others, how those business decisions create a set of national security risks. But that's not the only domain. The companies that own and operate critical infrastructure make risk decisions every day about, for example, what the appropriate level of investment is in cybersecurity that has a material impact on the resilience of the country against cyber attacks. So by the end of the Obama administration, these tensions seemed everywhere. And China loomed increasingly large over these tensions with its growing economic clout, its fast-growing innovation ecosystem, its growing military power, its efforts to establish domestic policies to govern these dynamic and interrelated domains, and importantly, the influence that China's efforts are having on how other governments around the world approach governance. And yet, I was frustrated during my time in government with how little serious policy and scholarly engagement there was in the United States, especially in Washington, D.C., with China's efforts to establish these governance domains. Too often, analysts would import cynical and simplistic assumptions about China's motivations into their analyses. Now, of course, China's animated by objectives that patriotic Americans would find objectionable, but it always struck me as probably far more complicated than the caricatures we often see coming out of DC. And the risk there is that that can result in bad policy. DigitChina, which you will hear more about for the remainder of the hour, is a true diamond in the rough. It's an effort to move beyond cynical and simplistic assumptions about China's behavior. It's a platform for informed analysis of engagement with and critique of China's efforts to craft a governance regime for its digital economy. And it's an example of the sort of research and collaboration that this program plans to undertake to advance its research and teaching around technology and risk at the intersection of international security and economic affairs. So I'm thrilled to partner with New America on this. Quick run of show. We have I'm going to ask our IT team here to cue a video in just a moment. We have a taped message from Anne-Marie Slaughter, the CEO of New America. And then I'm going to turn it over to Ian Wallace from New America to introduce DigitChina. So please cue the video.
I'm Anne-Marie Slaughter, the CEO of New America, and I'm so sorry I can't be with you today. I want to start by congratulating my good friend Mike McFall on the launch of the Stanford Cyber Policy Center. I'm particularly pleased that New America's DigiChina initiative will be part of this center partnering with the program on geopolitics, technology, and governance. As the former dean of Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School and the former director of policy planning at the State Department, I have been a strong advocate of bringing technology together with policy and indeed with public problem solving more broadly in every dimension of our public life. And as an international relations expert, it is obvious to me, as it is to all of us, that the US-China relationship and the rise of China more generally are two of the most important forces shaping 21st century life. I couldn't be more happy to bring those things together at New America. New America is dedicated to the renewal of America in an age of rapid technological and social change. Our work on China focuses on the DigiChina initiative led by Graham Webster. That initiative tries to make access to China's digital economy accessible to non-Mandarin speakers. We launched that initiative, Graham and his team, with Ian, who you'll hear from shortly. But we realized to take it forward, to move from startup to scale up, we needed a university partner. And when you think about startups and scale-ups, you look immediately to California, and we knew that Stanford was absolutely the ideal partner. We're particularly happy to be part of your launch today, and I want to give a shout out to the efforts of Andrew Grotto getting us there. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day. Again, I wish I could be with you, but we could not be happier to be partnering with you. Thank you.
That actually reminds me, I want to give a quick shout out to someone who also couldn't be with us here today, Sam Sachs, who's an integral part of the DigiChina team. She had a conflict and couldn't join us today, but I believe she's watching through the live stream. Hi, Sam. Wish you could be here. So I'd like to invite Ian Wallace to the stage now, as well as Mike Solito and Graham Webster. And so Ian is going to talk a little bit more about New America, and Ian is the senior fellow and the director of the cyber initiative at New America. Before that, he worked in the British Ministry of Defense, where, among other responsibilities, he was the main liaison between the UK military and US Cyber Command. So, Ian, why don't you come up here and take it away? And Mike, do you guys want to come up?
Andy, thank you very much. As Andy said, my name is Ian Wallace. I run the cybersecurity initiative at New America. We interpret cybersecurity very broadly, think cyber and security, and cover a number of areas, and over the years have been generously supported by the Hewlett Foundation, Eli, and others. But for those of you who don't know New America, as Anne-Marie implied, technology is at the center of what we do. Technology in pursuit of public policy, and certainly latterly public policy in response to technology. And it's increasingly clear to us that not all of that technology is necessarily going to be made in America. And it's also the case that the rules, or at least the way in which that technology is employed, isn't necessarily going to be controlled and constrained by necessarily American rules and regulations. And so it's that insight that led us 2 years ago to establish our DigiChina project. And we are, as Anne-Marie said, extremely excited to be able to take it forward with Stanford. There is clearly a lot going on in the digital economy in China, and we simply don't have the resources to do it justice. We made, I think, a pretty good start, and I should take this opportunity to give credit to the Harvard MIT Ethics and Governance of AI Fund. These are two East Coast universities that you may not have heard of, but most of the money for that fund, I think, came from the West Coast, including from the Hewlett Foundation. But that money was explicitly seed funding to get us started. And as we were coming to the end of that, we were looking at where we could have our exit, to use the local vernacular. And as Anne-Marie also said, there are one obvious candidate, and that was Stanford. And the very fact that this coincides with the startup of your center works extremely well for all of us, I think. So I want to make 3 quick points, and then I will get out of the way and leave it to the experts, particularly Graham Webster, who is the founding editor of DigiChina and the prime architect behind it. First thing I want to say, 3 things. First thing I want to say is that you're getting a really good brand. For example, the translation of China's AI plan, we reckon was certainly been downloaded by about 19,000 people, probably the PDF being downloaded by more than that. So close to 50,000 people are using the New America translation of that to understand where China is on AI. That means that when they think of China's AI, they think of New America. We are very excited to share that brand with the center and Andy's program. And I think we should think very carefully about how we make best use of that opportunity, because I think it does really give us a great opportunity as we go forward. Second, and in some ways a version of the same thing, I want to really impress upon you that DigiChina is really a community before it's a website. So the website is important. That website is going to shift from New America to Stanford. That's going to be the go-to place for these open source translations. But sitting behind that is a community of scholars, I guess somewhere between 25, 30 China experts who are working together to pull these translations that, at least out of government, it's almost impossible to get anywhere else. And Graham and some of his senior colleagues have done a fantastic job of mentoring, particularly female scholars, younger scholars, and I'm excited, and I know that Andy shares this aspiration, that this can be one of the focuses of the program as we move forward in its new incarnation. Third thing to say is that DigiChina's success hasn't happened by accident. It's the brand building and the community building has been the result of a lot of hard work. And that hard work has been particularly the work of Graham Webster. As Andy said, Sam Sachs, who is another one of our colleagues at New America, who earlier this week launched a new project herself on data and great power competition, highly relevant to some of the conversations that we're having today, particularly how data regimes clash in other countries. And I think that's going to play into the DigiChina work as also. And Paul Triello and Roger Kremers have been key players as our China Digital Economy Fellows. But really, Graham has been the sort of prime mover. And one of the practical aspects of shifting this project to Stanford is that you get custody of Graham. And that is to your great benefit. He's too good an asset to lose completely, so we will maintain an affiliation. He will maintain affiliation with us. We won't let him go. But I think there is, use him. He is a treasure. So I think I've embarrassed Graham enough and taken up enough of your time. But to reiterate what Anne-Marie said, we can't think of a better place to take this project forward with. Good luck with the center, and thank you for the opportunity. Andy.
Thanks. So I will invite Graham to come up and provide a little more detail about what DigiChina is more concretely, then walk you through a few focus areas, priority areas that he and his team have dived into over the past year or so. Graham, you can sit, you can go to the podium, whatever you're comfortable with.
Well, why don't I stand up just for a little bit? I think I have 2 mics on now, so I'm going to turn one off in case the world is going to collapse. Well, thank you everybody for being here and for everything so nice that's been said about DigiChina. I should probably begin by describing what it is exactly we do. There's a community of about 25 people who've contributed so far, and we search out key documents from the Chinese digital policy sphere. We translate them, and then we provide context and analysis in terms of what these things mean to an international audience. It began organically. A few of us had an email group, and we were, sending things around and saying, this really ought to be translated. It's going to be a lot easier to talk about what the implications are if people can read it in English. And then we just put it on somebody's blog. And after a little while of doing that, we got very lucky in finding a home at New America. Thanks very much to Ian Wallace, who was just speaking, where we were given a much greater platform, access to a broader community of policy experts, and anyway, a bunch of good friends, and we're really grateful for that. But what we've been talking about today on all of the panels, really revolves around several big questions that we keep asking when we decide what to translate and how to try to understand it. At the center of this is the industrial and social transformation that has to do with the current wave of technologies that are coming online. This means AI, automation, Internet of Things, or whatever sort of buzzwords you want, but essentially the advance of digital technology, data-driven technology, and connectivity throughout our lives raises a lot of questions that we've been grappling with. On the sort of human rights and governance side, questions of rights to privacy and free expression, and the way that those areas of life are handled in China are very much at the center of things. Being most of us Americans, or at least based in the US, we also have been part of discussions about whether China is driving part of a wave of illiberalism that is enabled or enacted through digital technologies. And we think sometimes about, when we observe these things happening around the world, how much of that story is a China story versus a broader evolution of different governments around the world. We believe that it's important to understand China's role in the global transformations. It's important to everybody around the world. What happens online in China doesn't stay in China. It affects all kinds of things around the world. And even if it did stay in China, it's worth paying attention because 1/5 of the people on this planet live in China. It's fundamentally important on a human level. So we've began this project from a basically factual inquiry-based approach. The community of contributors that we have are diverse in terms of many ways, but not least of which is we disagree about some of the implications of the things that we observe and translate and analyze. So we might translate the cybersecurity law that went into effect in 2017 and find different implications for global security, US national security, for the Chinese economy, for human rights. But what we've been able to come together on is to communicate the fundamentals that can drive a better informed discussion. So what I want to do quickly is go through a few areas that we are watching right now and that are going to be on our agenda as we move into the future. And I hope that, without trying to do this on purpose, one of our contributors is in the room today. I hope there will be more, perhaps from the room here, but certainly from the Stanford community, students and faculty alike. We are excited to take on these questions with a broader community, staying in touch with the innovative work that's being done in Washington and around the world by the New America Network, but really also benefiting from the incredible resources and intellectual diversity of Stanford. So I'm going to talk about 3 different areas of policy that we're watching, each of which have really taken flight since 2017 when the cybersecurity law went into effect. and each of which in some ways engages US-China relations and has a bit of a spin, at least, put on it by the events of the last few weeks, during which the Trump administration has gone after Huawei and supply chain security in a really vivid way that has implications for China's development, US development, interoperability online, and a bunch of different policy areas. Okay, so the three policy areas are supply chain security and cybersecurity reviews. Number two, personal information protection and data governance. And number three, efforts to develop and shape artificial intelligence. So starting in the first, this is probably the most in the news recently, supply chain security and cybersecurity review. For years, our group and others have been watching as the Chinese government sets up a regime to try to ensure higher levels of security among the equipment and products and services that get installed in crucial roles in the Chinese economy and society. The cybersecurity law sort of sets up the broad strokes for some of this, but then the way that Chinese regulation usually works is that a law will set the top level plan and you have to wait for the detailed regulations. There are longstanding concerns in China's policy thinking world about how to ensure that technology systems are secure and controllable is one buzzword, or maybe the more relevant one just recently is secure and reliable, a phrase that plays into a new move against the US to match the American move by perhaps listing certain companies as unreliable. But we're watching this evolve right after the more or less collapse of the US-China economic negotiations just in the last few weeks. A bunch of cybersecurity and digital economy policy documents that had been in reserve have started to pour out. And one of them is an updated set of detailed policies on cybersecurity review, describing how the Chinese government plans to essentially require review for certain products and services, and then how those reviews will happen. Some of this stuff is directly responsive to foreign concerns. There's new language since the last version that looks at preventing intellectual property loss. Of course, we'll see about the enforcement, but foreign companies have long been concerned that if the Chinese government wants to review the products and services, they may get access to proprietary information and hand it to a competitor. Over the last 2 years since the first draft came out, the whole regime around the cybersecurity law has better integrated things like infrastructure security with personal information protection. And some of this stuff actually directly mirrors some of the Trump administration's language. Some of you may have watched the executive order targeting supply chain security from gear linked to a foreign adversary. The newest version of the Chinese measures on cybersecurity review identify the possibility of supply chain disruption due to non-technical factors like politics, diplomacy, and trade. You know, perhaps if the Americans are blocking certain components. And situations in which product or service providers are funded, controlled, et cetera, by foreign governments. What we've seen in just the last few weeks is both the US government and the Chinese government have given some of their bureaucracy new powers to block suppliers from the other because of their association with a rival government. So that's just a taste of what we're watching on the cybersecurity reviews. The next two I'll go a little more quickly. Personal information protection and data governance. There's a popular view that privacy in China doesn't make any sense because the government is simply going to do surveillance and you can't hide. Well, that might be true, but if you split the notion of privacy or personal information protection in two, you can observe that the Chinese government is installing really pretty robust systems of regulation protecting user information from companies, from the platforms, or requiring security practices that would protect them from cyber criminals. So there's this huge movement that we've done several major translations on to protect consumer information from the companies, even as the state, when they claim state security or social stability, has essentially unlimited powers of surveillance. So it's sort of a one thing and the other thing, and you can't throw out the notion that the Chinese digital economy has strong personal information protections, just as you can't throw out the reality that surveillance powers are essentially unlimited. There are a couple of things we're watching in the coming months, so translations you'll see coming. Scholars and officials are drafting a personal information protection law. They tried this about 15 years ago, and it got into a draft form, and then it just washed out. The National People's Congress in China did not advance the law to debate and passage. Now there's a new draft that accommodates all the new policy and technological changes over that period of time, and this is coming on to the scene. There's also a data security law, which is more about cybersecurity. It's focused on the data element as opposed to the operations or other aspects. This is stuff where our colleague Sam Sachs is going to be a key part of our ongoing work in her work on China, where she has a long history as an analyst, and in comparison with other parts of the world. The third area, essentially AI, I raise it specifically because it cuts across all of the areas that we cover, because the industrial policy is there. How is the Chinese government promoting development? How is it giving its businesses an edge? How is it viewing international competition? And it also is something that we had a big hit on. A couple of years ago, the Chinese government released the New Generation Artificial Intelligence Development Plan. And a few of us put together a translation that we think was the first to get out there in full in English. But the interesting thing about this plan, as you dive a little deeper, is that there is an interactive sort of US-China element there. When the Chinese plan came out, it has this eye-popping assertion that China will try to become a world-leading center for AI development by, I think, 2030. That got a lot of people really worked up in the US, saying, holy moly, we're going to have to do something about this big, this potential competitor. Well, if you go and talk to the people who drafted that plan in China, they'll tell you that what got them going in the first place was that the Obama administration had put together a strategic plan on AI and society and economic development. This is an interactive process. And so when we look at the potential for concrete competition between the two countries, or with other countries around the world and other groupings of countries, one of the things that we're going to be working on doing a little better now that we have access to an even broader scholarly community is putting it in the context of interaction and all the sort of dynamics that come in there. The last thing I want to say is that I'm just really delighted that we can bring this to Stanford. I happen to have started learning Mandarin 12 years ago next month, just around the corner here during a summer program. It's kind of magical to be back here. In the interim, I've gotten a lot better at reading and writing and speaking Mandarin, and a lot worse at running the dish trail up in the hills there. It also enables us to sort of take a step change from what we've been doing for these first 2 years. We have about 52 pieces that we've published so far, an average of 3 co-authors, and we've been just responding to events most of the time. It's been essentially news motivated. We try to stay on top of what's the most important stuff, and we're going to keep doing that. But being in a university gives us the ability to respond to less kind of fleeting or less news agenda driven questions. We can talk to scholars in various disciplines, people who are specialists in China, people who are not, and then we'll learn some better questions to ask. There's an unlimited amount of stuff that we can translate and try to interpret in that context, and I'm really looking forward to all the interaction that we're going to have and building some new areas of inquiry that will really fill out the effort. And the final thing that I'll say is that this is when we are coming around to a great element of our long-term plan. One of our partners who Ian Wallace mentioned, Roger Kramers at University of Leiden, has for years done solo translations, and we're going to be giving those a once-over and bringing them into one place and adding to them, and we're going to have ultimately a repository of dozens and then later hundreds of key documents on China and the internet and industrial development. So we have a lot of ambition here, but even as I say it, it actually sounds really realistic. So I guess we're just going to have to aim even bigger. So thanks to all of you. I look forward to the discussion here. And yeah, it was great.
So for the last 15 minutes, what I thought we would do is we'd have a discussion among us. I want to introduce my good friend and former and current colleague, Mike Solito. Mike was a colleague of mine at the National Security Council in the Cyber Directorate, where he was the lead on sort of the international diplomatic dimensions of our cyber diplomacy from the White House. And now he is the deputy director of the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. I'm going to sit down in a second, but I don't have a mic, so I want to ask you a question, and I'll sit down and join y'all. But Mike, I'd love for you to provide us with a little bit of color on your engagements with the Chinese on some of these digital economy topics. And you also sort of spanned both the Obama and the Trump administration. I'd love for you to provide us a little, sort of compare and contrast, if you would, on how the two White Houses organized their China engagements, and then sort of the substance of how the Chinese responded and interacted with their American interlocutors.
Great, thanks, Andy, and thanks for the introduction. I was feeling a bit of an introduction gap because Graham here got introduced by at least 3 different people, and so.
My fault.
But I really appreciate that Graham's comments about how the Chinese strategy was really informed by the American strategy, because I think one of the things that often surprised people is when we would meet with the Chinese and complain about policy X, Y, or Z, they would say, well, but wait a minute, we base that on the American sanctions policy or the American policy on A, B, or C. And that interplay and the fact that the Chinese understand American policy better than Americans understand Chinese policy, I think is really often lost. And one of the observations that I had working at the White House for a few years under 2 administrations is that the higher you get up the chain, the more of the world and the world's problems folks have to cover, and the less depth they can get into. And so you end up with a situation where when you get from the sort of assistant secretary level to the deputy level to the cabinet secretary level, there's just sort of a assumption at a certain point that, well, everybody else is just like Americans, but they're located elsewhere. And so they have the same interests and desires and wants and needs. And if we were only to put voting booths in a particular country in the Middle East, then democracy would break out. And the Chinese really just want to be like Americans, but they don't have access to Google or what have you. And so I'm really excited to work with Graham, the DigiChina project here, because I think that really studying the nuance of the policy, how it was developed in the context, and what the sort of real Chinese interests are behind it is going to be really critical. And since I'm up here and I've got the floor, I want to put just a quick plug in for what my institute's doing, and then we'll bring it back to what we're talking about here. So Stanford announced in mid-March that we've created the new Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence Institute. This is really a broad-based institute that's hoping to touch and leverage all aspects of the university to look at how we can promote a human-centered approach to AI. And it's really based on 3 principles. 1, what is the next generation of AI technologies, and how do we incorporate more of the nuance and versatility of the human mind in really generating the breakthroughs that are going to make the technology more capable than it is today? two, what's the human impact of the technology going to be, and how can we be a little bit more thoughtful in guiding the developments and deployments of the technology? Silicon Valley and Stanford is a very optimistic place, and there's generally an assumption that you develop technology and you release it into the world and only good things will naturally happen. Sometimes that's maybe not the case. And so, as Andy said in his introduction, with the potential transformative nature of this third wave of technologies, we should probably be a little bit more thoughtful about what the technology is going to do. And then the third piece is really how can we support the development of AI technologies that augments human capabilities as opposed to focus on just replacing people, but augment capabilities, support people, do good things for society. And really on this piece around the human impact, I think the goal is to look at how do we ensure that we can all broadly benefit from the technology, but also be thoughtful about the ethical use of the technology, about bias and data and algorithms. What's the future of work and how do we prepare society? And then how do we think through these geopolitical concerns that Andy's brought up? And I think that, particularly in a period like today where you have this framing around a AI arms race between the US and China, the work that the Governance Project here and DigiChina are going to do is really going to be critical. If you think about the two ways that this is framed, one in terms of with vis-a-vis China with sort of an economic dominance, somebody's going to win AI, and then that's going to, I don't know what that's going to do, but something. It's very nebulous, right? What the concern is there, and I think that some aspects of that are a little bit overblown. And then the second is really on this race for military superiority, and of course the U.S. military has a long history of using technology to gain advantage, and you have China that sees itself, probably rightly so, is behind in terms of the capabilities that has vis-a-vis the United States, and is really looking for technology to help leapfrog by a few generations so that it can develop a more credible challenge, pose a more credible challenge to the American military. And AI is going to be a really critical area where both these countries are going to be looking to gain advantage. Just as an anecdote, and then I'll stop talking, I was speaking at a conference in China last year at a PLA associated university, which is really tasked with developing AI technologies that are going to go into military applications. And as sort of the token American, they gave me a nice speaking spot on the keynote panel. And actually, there were two keynote panels because there was so much brass speaking that I was in the second keynote panel after all the generals. And they all basically had the same message, which is, AI is really going to revolutionize how the Chinese military functions. It's going to give us advantage that's going to be really substantial and durable. And we need civil military integration so that we can leverage all the benefits of our private sector and the technologies being developed in the civilian area and bring it into the military area. Nobody, mentioned anything about the risks of this strategy, and so, as I like to do, I decided to get up there and pour some cold water. And my remarks were really around, what's the risk of putting the technology, which is right now not very capable. It's very good in particularly narrow applications. It breaks really easy outside of those applications. What's the training set for modern warfare that you're going to feed the algorithms with? I don't know. And how do we actually ensure that the technology is reliable and robust? And so, I think as Andy said, there's a real interest that we as citizens of the world have in generating the kind of research, engagement, and dialogue between governments and between academic organizations where government-to-government cooperation and dialogue is not possible, to really think through what are the risks of the path that we're going down and where do we have a shared interest in taking some steps to reduce that risk. In the nuclear space, there was a lot of cooperative risk reduction. There was sharing of technologies to make to make nuclear weapons safer. What's the analog here in AI, and how do we make sure we don't end up somewhere that we don't want to be and nobody intended?
So should we do some audience? You guys comfortable with that?
Sure.
Yeah, so I'd love to invite questions from you all, if you have any. I think you've got your hand up there. Can you get a mic? Or you can just shout if you're comfortable.
Simple question. Yeah. In your work, much is the automated translation process helping the work that you're already setting forth doing?
Yeah, thanks. Well, it's right now we're not using it as a programmatic thing, but as an editor of translations that are done by multiple people, I can tell that some people are referring to the Google translation or the Tencent translation when they're doing it. I don't say that as a negative thing. It's very helpful. It's also something that we're talking about exploring intentionally in the context of this project now that we're in a Stanford context, which is a slightly more high power place in terms of CS than New America is. But you know, we want to see if we can actually improve some of the algorithms or sort of hatch something custom that will, you know, right now, if you take a Chinese legal document to Google Translate, you know, you get sort of 60, 70% of the way there. But it's the details that matter in legal docs. You know, you got to get them right, and all of the translations have to be right because people are going to read them very closely. And so if we can get to, you know, 80 or 90% with the right training set and people who actually know what they're doing, then that'll lighten the load on the human scholars, and it'll really surface what are the hard questions. You know, which concepts do we really need to distinguish? So yeah, it's a good question, but it's part of the process for sure.
So Graham, thank you very much for your wonderful translation of that document, which I read avidly. And they say that their aim is, it's probably maybe just bureaucratic aim, is to catch up in AI by 2025, right? And they also think there's going to be a big revolution in AI by then, which I suspect is right. But they also said something very interesting, that they're opening to collaborating with us in this revolution. One, are they sincere? And two, should we take them up on it?
So the question is, in China's AI development plan, there were expressed intentions to cooperate with international actors. I can't remember if they named specific states or not, but anyway, the US is one of the folks that they would be referring to. And are they sincere, and should the US do it? I think here, the sincerity is definitely there. I mean, it's basic strategy. If you view yourself as coming up from behind in a particular realm, you know, collaborating with some of the leaders is a good way to learn and to get better at things. And that's, you know, it doesn't even have to be done on purpose. We're sitting here at Stanford University, where people go and get degrees in computer science and things, and then move around the world and work for different companies. I mean, some of them are Chinese companies, some of them are Chinese people at non-Chinese companies. The learning process happens anyway. But as for who should do what and what types of collaborations should happen, I think it needs to be a granular question. So, you know, one of the great concerns, I sort of alluded to the, you know, splitting privacy in two, right? You can't presume privacy from the state in China, but there's some pretty serious regulation that looks a lot like Europe's GDPR on privacy from companies. Well, I think there are serious ethical questions to be asked about what obligations technological innovators around the world have in terms of working on things that can be applied to surveillance technology. There is a live, active human rights emergency in Xinjiang right now, with reports ranging from hundreds of thousands to multiple millions of people detained in camps. And one of the ways that people get put in the camps is that you know, various technologies are used to analyze their personal devices or their online activities. And people should think about if they want to be culpable there. But I think it's a hard question that I don't have all the answers to, because, you know, the Chinese government is also using Microsoft Excel. You know, should Microsoft stop producing spreadsheet technology because it is sometimes used for negative things? You know, it's an intentionally absurd question, but, you know, there's a decision to be made there. And I think those people who would advance a black or white answer to that across all AI technologies are not being realistic at this point. It's going to be a tough set of questions.
That was well said, Graham. And I'm noticing, do we have time for one more question, or should we cut? One more? Cool, thank you, Alison. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm the Austrian consul in San Francisco, and I have a question about a little bit about this willingness of China to collaborate internationally, or even going further, in what way China's strategy goes beyond the domestic Chinese situation. There's the Belt and Road Initiative, which has a very strong technological component as well when it comes to infrastructure. China is developing a lot of relationships with Africa, with Latin America, with some European countries as well. In what way is China leveraging its technological achievements also to gain geopolitical, geoeconomic advantages when it projects its influence around the globe?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question and a tough one, I think, because it's hard to assess the level of intentionality on the part of China as a massive, a single entity. What's clear to me is that Chinese technological innovators, tech companies, are developing products that are compelling to users and whether they're individual users who want a good cell phone or infrastructure customers around the world. They're making attractive products at attractive prices, and even more attractive sometimes when there are favorable loan terms involved. Is this a play for geopolitical leverage? I just think that's sort of hard to assess as a unitary thing. I think the way to look at it is that the Communist Party and the Chinese leader Xi Jinping have been very clear over the last few years that it is a goal of the government and the party to make China into what we translate as a cyber superpower. We have a whole piece on this, so you can translate it in a few different ways. Maybe a cyber great power, or anyway, a big kid on the block along with all the big guys. And that this is part of a vision for rejuvenation and essentially advancement of China as a country. And to some extent, you can't really argue with that. Any country should expect their government to come up with plans to enhance national greatness. Where the question comes in is, do those products carry along with them political, governance, security implications that customers or other observers should be concerned about? And I think the answer is sometimes yes, and sometimes it's overblown. Again, as with AI, it splits into a million different specific applications and specific products. I'm not a fan of blanket bans of one thing or another because I think they tend to throw out a lot of pretty innocuous stuff along with the sensitive stuff. But yeah, whether intentional or not, the reason we're paying attention to this is because the Chinese government has this ambition to achieve greater things. And the Chinese people and the companies and all the innovators are building increasingly relevant stuff. So the presence is there around the world, whether there's a master plan behind it or not. And that's kind of our starting point. And I'll let the kind of other analysts and political folks decide how they want to assign intentionality. But thanks.
Well, thank you all for your time and attention, and thank you guys for participating. And I'm very excited about our collaboration. And thanks, Mike, for joining us. And apologies again for the introduction gap.